Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of News in Depth here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee. A strange movement along Estonia's eastern border is raising alarms. Armed, unidentified men, not in border guard uniform, were spotted pacing the Saste boot area, a narrow stretch of road where Estonia cuts through Russian territory. The move echoes a disturbing deja vu, the little green man of Crimea in 2014. So what is Putin signaling and why now? Joining us today on News in Depth is our reporter Randy Potts, who's been following the story. Hello, Randy. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So before we kick things off, let's take a look at the statement from the Estonian border guard, see what we're dealing with here, as well as tape.
From 3 o'clock on, our patrols detected that the groups were moving onto the road, passing through the Saatse Pass, and while at first they were moving along the road, at some point they lined up crosswise on the road.
So Randy, can you help us understand the significance of this and kind of understand the optics a little bit? Why is it important that they're not dressed in border guard uniforms and this kind of lining up crosswise on public road? What does that signify?
So we are, of course, used to seeing Russian troops along the border. This is NATO's eastern flank. They appear regularly doing exercises, whether it's official ones like Zapad 2025 or just small troop movements. But we aren't at all used to seeing what we just saw, which is, it was 7 men. They were in what looked like military tactical gear. They appeared to be organized in some way, but with no insignia. It set off a lot of alarms because we are not used to seeing that, and Russia is very purposeful about its actions, and so we know that this is some kind of message, and so instantly alarms went off across NATO's capitals.
Right, so the big question is, what kind of message are they trying to send, right? A lot of people are kind of thinking about the 2014 incident where Russians are lining their troops around Crimea before finally, of course, annexing the whole place altogether. Do you think that they are trying to invoke this imagery to kind of instill some sort of fear, or are there any kind of real logistical concerns that they might have for their actions?
So it does seem like it's primarily a visual fear tactic. Mm-hmm. It does look identical if you look at the footage, of 2014. These unidentified little green men, as they called them, in Crimea. But the differences are very stark because at the time, Ukraine was not really prepared for war, whereas along Estonia's border, it's very heavily fortified. There are regular NATO exercises. So in terms of visuals, it looks the same, but in pretty much every other respect, it's a very different kind of scenario now.
Right, so it's really hard to really get into their heads to what's the true purpose of this. But can you also help us understand that road? Why is it so unique? We do know it crosses into Russian territory, but now they are planning to kind of reroute entirely. How does that work? Right,
so it's kind of like a little peninsula of Russia that sticks out into Estonia. They call it the Saatse boot. It's almost like a boot shape. And there's this road that goes right through it that used to be that Estonians could drive along to go even to visit friends in the hospital, whatever, but they couldn't get out of their car because they were officially in Russia, even though they were along an Estonian highway. So that highway has been closed, and to go around the boot is about, going to take about 4 times as long to drive around the boot. So you can see why they didn't want to resort to that. But now it appears that we may not ever see the reopening of that highway.
Right. How does that fit into Estonia's broader security policy? Are we essentially looking at a more hardening of the EU-Russia front line?
Absolutely. So, going back to the 80s, before the collapse of the USSR, this border was only kind of a formality. It was really between 2 states of the USSR. And even in the last 30 years, the tendency to move it more towards a hardened border has been pretty slow. So even before the full-scale invasion in 2022, there was a lot of traffic between these borders. But it is now becoming much more hardened. And with the closure of this highway, it's just one more sign that this is now a fully militarized border that is not in any foreseeable soon future will we see much traffic.
Right, thank you for that. And with the background out of the way, let's take a look at how some of the European officials are reacting to it, starting with Ursula von der Leyen. We also have her statement, so let's take a look.
Mm-hmm. This is not random harassment. It is a coherent and escalating campaign to unsettle our citizens, test our resolve, divide our union, and weaken our support for Ukraine. And it is time to call it by its name. This is hybrid warfare. New technologies, born in the defense sectors, bringing new applications for civilian industries, whether it is from cybersecurity tools to, for example, advanced materials for shipbuilding and aerospace. Our new defense investment can and it must contribute to Europe's competitiveness. It must be based in our union, and that's why at least 65% of any project funded under SAFE must be here from the European Union. This is European money, and we want to see a return on investment of this European money in jobs here in Europe.
So it does sound like Ursula von der Leyen is alluding to the fact that this is perhaps not just a local border incident, but something of a coordinated, wider action within Russia's hybrid warfare. Do you think that this is indeed something that's more coordinated, kind of planned to provoke or test NATO's resolve?
So that is certainly what it looks like. During peacetime, it's normal for even friendly nations to maybe spy on each other a little bit of industrial sabotage, that kind of thing. But this is very different. We've seen multiple airports in Europe had to be shut down. We've seen Russian MiGs scrambling over Estonian territory. These are things that haven't happened, that are not normal between friendly nations. And as I said earlier, Russia is very purposeful about all of its actions. And so if it is behind the drones, it's doing them for some kind of reason. And I think it's very safe to say that that is something more on a war footing than a peace footing.
Right, speaking of war footing, the Estonia's defense minister actually stated very recently that Russia has been at war with the West since 2007. Of course, he cites like cyber attacks and assassination, all sorts of other hybrid warfare. But do you think that is a proper framing to kind of see this as a quote-unquote war, or is this just perhaps the next phase of a hybrid sort of attack?
So I think, hindsight is 20/20, and it does start to look like that framing is more and more appropriate, because if you look back even at diplomatic relationships, pretty much everything Russia has done since that point has been on what we really should recognize as more of a war footing. They're not the actions of a neighbor that, say, wants to foster more relations, wants to foster more trade. They're not those actions, and the framing, I think, it fits.
Right. Do you think it's going to be kind of a general understanding that we are in this sort of hybrid warfare, or do you think that there's still going to be some disconnect and perhaps varying opinion within European leaders, which might lead to kind of inefficiencies when it comes to deal with these Russian hybrid attacks?
Right, so that's hard to say, but we have seen a lot of movement, not just with von der Leyen, but with other prime ministers, presidents, who are tending to move towards the position of this is something more serious. It tends to be the countries further and further away from the border are less and less concerned. But we have actually seen even Macron, we see the UK getting more serious. Mm-hmm. So we are probably right now already in what we were during the Cold War, when there were, between the USSR and the US, there were these little things going on a lot, and they were scary and constant. And so I feel like we are already in something similar to that.
Great. Now, I would also like to cite one of the intelligence analysts, John Hillian, who's also chimed in on this particular issue, and let's take a look at what he has to say.
Now, Estonians have been able to use that road regularly, and they can still probably use that road for a while, even though tensions have been getting higher. But it's clear that the Estonian government is now looking at alternative ways of sort of bypassing this situation.
So like you mentioned, Estonia is now going to try and reroute and essentially no longer cross into Russia or use that road anymore. Do you think that this is going to be sort of a pattern going forward, where we see Estonia and its neighbors responding in a more practical sort of way? Is infrastructure like roads and airspace now being militarized in real time?
Yes, absolutely. So for instance, Estonia is building up its rail service, and a lot of that buildup, even though it's it's officially focused on passenger rail service, etc., there are a lot of military considerations going into that. And of course, Estonia being on the eastern flank, this so-called drone wall, which NATO is discussing, would also include Estonia. And so there's a lot of drone research, there is infrastructure going on. Estonia and the other two Baltics are very much they very much understand that they are small countries and that this threat is real, and they need to kind of revamp everything. And there are signs that they are doing that comprehensively.
Right now, like you mentioned before, Russia seems to be very deliberate within its actions. And one thing that I can shake the feeling of is the timing. Do you think that it has anything to do with the coming Trump-Putin? Well, this comes as Zelensky met Trump, and then this also days before the planned Trump-Putin summit in Hungary. Do you think that these are anyhow related?
So it seems like it has to be, because Russia hasn't done this before. It's an interesting tactic, though, because I think it seems like Putin's assumption would be that what happens is you put fear into the populace, and then they agitate and call on their leaders to accept some kind of so-called peace for Ukraine, which might mean annexation, whatever. But the polls are not reflecting that. The population of most European countries are actually showing a lot of resolve in the face of these sort of scare tactics. And so it's hard to imagine what the grand strategy is, but there does seem to be some sort of strategy behind this.
Right. I think we're all trying to put ourselves in his shoe and try to think of why doing it at this time, because like you mentioned, this does sound a little bit counterintuitive, especially having past experience of how Putin's been dealing with Trump and essentially, striking after every negotiation. This does seem like he's been getting on Trump's bad side, and also Trump seems to be going into this bit more pro-Ukraine compared to before. Do you think there's any calculus behind it? There's any sort of 3D chess play, or do you think it's another kind of miscalculation going into this?
So I would say personally that it's a miscalculation. There's this sort of mythos that Russia is this grand chess strategist, and that doesn't bear out with the facts. They said they would take Ukraine in 3 days, and it's been 3.5 years, and they've taken not even 20% of Ukrainian territory. But absolutely, we do have to deal with the moods of Donald Trump, and those have shifted a lot. And so maybe this is something where Putin is trying to, for instance, appear strong, because Trump does sort of respond to appearances of strength, and when Zelensky appeared stronger, Trump seemed to maybe side with him a little bit more. And so one thing I've thought about is if Putin is looking stronger, he might feel like that makes him more confident when he meets with Trump.
But do you think that's going to bode well for him, though, if you have to kind of predict a little bit?
So it's very hard to say. I think what's strange is Zelensky's been talking about tomahawks. Trump sounded for a little bit like he was willing to send tomahawks to Ukraine, enough to where we got a response from Putin saying, we can't have any tomahawks. But now all of a sudden, Trump just this week is sort of being more wishy-washy and kind of like, well, maybe we need to keep the tomahawks for ourselves. So in that sense, if he does not give Ukraine tomahawks, that would, many people consider that a pretty big victory for Putin. And so maybe something Putin is doing is influencing Trump in that way.
Right. I've spoken to military analysts when it comes to the supplying of tomahawks, and some of the feedback that I've gotten is that even though, yes, these are very effective tools that Ukraine can use to target within Russia, but it's also more symbolic because there's a whole array of other stuff that U.S. can supply to Ukraine, and it's very important for them that these supplies, these military support come in a more consistent manner instead of like perhaps one tomahawk here and there. However, the symbolism behind the tomahawk missile and the fact that it's now becoming a very big topic, this kind of new shiny object, is going to play a very big part in the kind of psychological aspect of it. So do you think that like you mentioned, the wishy-washiness of Trump to supply this missile also imply that there's, and that's him leaving some space for negotiation and perhaps going into this talk having another card to play before kind of showing his hand?
I think so. So one thing that we've seen with Putin a lot is he really seems to like throwing down sort of red lines and saying, if you do this, he has, especially his, officials have sort of threatened even like nuclear war. We're going to bomb London. They've made all kinds of really bizarre threats. threats. But it all relates to these red lines that Putin throws down. But what we have also seen is that typically if NATO or some border country crosses the red line, nothing really happens. So he does seem to throw down these red lines. He may think that that gives him leverage in these upcoming talks in Budapest, but it's hard to see if that will really work because if he hasn't honored these red lines before.
Right now, Minister Pevkar warned that Russia is constantly testing where the threshold of NATO's Article 5 lies. Do you think that, well, what do you think it would take for NATO's Article 5 to actually be invoked? Does it take an actual kind of invasion of the border, or these sort of hybrid attacks is good enough for NATO to say, okay, we got to do something about it?
So an interesting thing about that is that, so before you invoke Article 5, you invoke Article 4. Since 2022, there have been 9 different countries who have invoked Article 4, and Estonia was one of them. But here's a really interesting thing. Since the little green men thing incident, Estonia has become the first country to invoke it twice. So it's now, like, I think the 3rd country to invoke it, and also the 10th. So I think, you know, with a country all of a sudden invoking Article 4 twice, that does suggest that we are getting a lot closer to Article 5 than we've ever been, for sure. And if more and more countries are pushing right up at the border of Article 5, you just have to wonder how long until they cross that. And it's interesting because more of the talk you're hearing is actually more resolve. Germany's now, moving towards more armament. This is actually building resolve in Europe, and so it's hard to say.
So last but not least, giving you the last word, hybrid warfare is all about perception. And if you want our audience to take anything away from this, how should we perceive this incident?
So I think that it's clear Putin is trying to scare the population, but we are seeing poll after poll and government action after government action that shows that Europe does not seem that scared and seems like it's ready to fight.
All right, brilliant. Thank you so much for your input and insight and for being with us here on News in Depth.
Absolutely, thank you.
Brittany, thanks. And thank you for tuning into this edition of News in Depth. Before more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.